are listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hello, my name is Uwe Schulte, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this podcast in our series Let's Talk Sustainable Business. It's brought to you by the Conference Board Global Sustainability Center. And today I will be continuing my conversation with Emilio Tenuta about water the new oil. Before we get started, as we are recording this podcast during the COVID-19 crisis, we would like to really express our solidarity with all that are suffering in this crisis and express our immense gratitude to all those supporting them, those in need. First, let me introduce to you our guest, Emilio Tenuta. He's Chief Sustainability Officer at Ecolab. Emilio has an MBA in General Management from Kellogg School of Management. And prior to Ecolab, he worked at Nalco, a world-leading water treatment company, today a subsidiary of Ecolab. Welcome back, Emilio. You gave us great insights in the last podcast about the looming global freshwater crisis. Today, we want to turn more to the solution and to the business opportunity side. And in the first part, you spoke about connections about water scarcity and climate change. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Sure, and thanks for having me. Climate, water, and energy are tightly connected, and addressing one, you address the other, really. So water scarcity would exist even without climate change, but climate change really worsens this significantly, the problem, right? The effects of climate change are mostly expressed in water. We see this through droughts, sea level rise, floods. We see extreme weather patterns. So as a result, if you use less water, you are less vulnerable to climate change. But at the same time, if you use less water, you also save energy. And because using water takes energy, you have to pump it, heat it, treat it, cool it. And because, most energy generated in this world still comes from fossil fuels, if you use less water, you will also lower your carbon emissions and help mitigate the effects of climate change. But it's really worth noting that oftentimes we don't think about the energy embedded in water conservation. But the fact that it really works both ways. If you help mitigate climate change, you'll also alleviate some of these water scarcity issues. So based on we're on the front lines at Ecolab, working across more than 40 different industries, and we have a unique perspective. And one of the perspectives on that point is that over 500 assessments that we actually recorded, where we actually worked in different, mostly food and beverage sector type of manufacturing facilities that use water, we can say that those facilities, the potential water use reductions average anywhere between 30 to 40% of that total site. The resulting potential energy savings by reducing their water use is somewhere between 15 to 20% in thermal energy savings, things like natural gas, and then 1 to 4% in electricity savings. So the results vary from facility to facility, but industrial facilities can reduce their carbon emissions by up to 20% by just simply lowering their water consumption. Now, a good example of that is a very large company that we have worked with, Archer Daniels Midland, ADM, where in that work in since 2012, Ecolab has worked with them to really save and drive a water conservation strategy to improve by improving the management of water through all their critical water circuits in their different facilities there, whether it be corn wet milling, whether it be making different products that go into a lot of the consumer packaged goods products that we get today. The program comprised of 200 projects at locations around the world. The result was, amazingly, that not only did we helped them be a lot more productive and efficient, requiring less water and energy. But they saved 2.3 billion gallons of water. And I'd have to do the math in my head, Uwe, on the number of liters that is, but it's equivalent to the annual drinking water needs of almost 8 million people. So along the way, we saved a lot of what I call, BTU, so, thermal energy, and CO2 emissions by 70 million pounds. So this demonstrates, I think, your point about how much water can be saved with a concerted effort and the right technology, but also how much of an impact you can have against climate just by focusing on water.
But then, when I listen to you, and when we talk about climate, the normal reaction is that let's talk about energy.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like water is the underappreciated part of this equation.
Absolutely. We often say that water is the forgotten chapter in the climate book. The Paris Treaty, believe it or not, doesn't mention the word water once, not once. So that's baffling, and it has to be corrected, and it will be hard to get after climate if we don't get after water. It's part of the solution. So one more example to illustrate this is, we worked with a coal-fired power plant in Great Britain that had issues. It had fouling condensers, which is a problem because it obviously drives inefficiency in terms of the production of steam to run the turbine, right? And so the plant had saved 22,000 tons of coal per year and reduced its CO2 emissions by 53,000 tons, over a 1% reduction in the equivalence of taking almost 23,000 passenger vehicles off the road. So the moral of the story is that even if we decarbonize the economy, many coal-fired power plants will operate for years, even though there's fewer and fewer, right, that are operating. Just doing this one money-saving thing, that can reduce the CO2 emissions by 1 to 2%. And there are, I think, over 6,500 coal-fired plants operating in the world today. If they all did this, that would be equivalent to taking, 66 to 132 of them offline overnight. They have. Oh, go ahead, please.
No, it just baffles me. When I listen to you, and you mentioned in the last podcast that unfortunately corporate water use is going up again instead of going down. But if it's if saving water saves energy, reduces carbon emission, and more importantly cuts costs, why are not more people doing that?
It is a great question, and I think a very vital question to getting after the water challenges that we have. Water, and the response is that water is currently underpriced. And so the perception of the ROI isn't high enough in the eyes of those that use it. So, but once a drought hits, like the one you experienced, for example, in Sao Paulo, and a company has to deal with the dependency that they have on water, because it really comes, it becomes a lot clearer to them how dependent they are on water, because it disrupts or interrupts their production. There's quality issues. They get skyrocketing prices, right? And a whole bunch of other regulations, in some cases, even water rationing, as you've heard of in places like India. So the real value of water must be seen in terms of that the business risk is represented. So, but it's not that companies aren't interested in water. In fact, more and more companies have ambitious water reduction goals. And we've seen this from some of the surveys that have been done with the state of green business each year. But they lack the expertise to achieve them, which is a challenge. According to a survey that Ecolab and GreenBiz, a large sustainability consultant and event coordinator, we found that 75% of the companies have water targets, and these are companies with $1 billion or more of revenue, but 82% of them, of that 75%, lack the tools and strategies to achieve them. That's a problem. 88% of the companies say they will take active steps to manage water use in the next 3 years, but half, only 44%, have a plan. So one big challenge is that water isn't like CO2, right? And see, we emit, CO2 into the atmosphere. It has an atmospheric impact. All water is local, right? And so that becomes a part of this, the challenge, right? Is that we have to really, every place is different. So you have climate, you have, you mentioned pollution, you mentioned population density, you mentioned the degree of industrialization. What works in one place may not work in another. That's why across the board, corporate goals that, peanut butter spread and efficiency target across their enterprise don't work. You must have context-based goals. Do the work at the individual facility level and empower the local teams really to take action where the issues and challenges are acute. That's where many companies, I think, stumble. They have trouble bridging that gap between corporate level and local level engagement, and we refer to that as the execution gap.
Let me share a personal experience. In another life, I was the head of a factory, and one of the things I thought was really silly. We were using fresh water to cool the process. Mm-hmm. So we introduced heat exchangers and used the same water again for cooling. Just some new fresh water now and then. The problem we got was that the local authorities said, you were really flushing out all the dirt in our sewage system and your water isn't coming anymore. We have a problem now. So what do you say to that?
Well, I mean, so good question. And in many ways, I go back to the risk factors that companies face. There are regulatory risk factors on top of physical risk factors like quantity and quality. And those are things that we have to really manage. And, the measures, some measures are very simple, right? Make sure that the team is accountable for water, you fix leaks, you turn the water off, all those things are easy. But in situations like you mentioned, you really have to have the right technology and the right measurement and monitoring to stay ahead of those challenges that you face with, right? And so that a good example of that for us is that we have technology, to your point about that from a real-time monitoring perspective can give a process within a manufacturing setting like you described the intelligence that you need not only to take the necessary action, but to do it in real time, right? And so, I often talk about this as an MRI system for water unit operations within a facility. Being able to have the right smart sensors in place, not only to know the quantity and quality of water and what changes in real time, but also take the necessary steps to be able to address and remediate the problem. And so we often find that we continue to not have enough data. We don't really understand how water is being used. We don't know what the critical water circuits are. And so we have invested a lot in building a digital capacity and capability where we have more than 40,000 digital sensors and units out in across many regions that allow us to monitor in real time the conditions of water and the impact that has to how much, the quality of that water, and the productivity and business objectives that lead to that EROI, that exponential impact that companies are looking for to really make the business case around water solutions.
Yeah, no, I get it. And by the way, my learning from my experience was when you do those things, don't do them in isolation. Talk to your authorities and plan the whole thing together, and then it's of course something that's beneficial for everybody. But um, I was I can relate to the point you're making. You know, at a corporate level, you set out a target. We're going to reduce so and so much, but the real issue is locally. But how do you close that gap?
Well, in many ways, we often say that it starts with the ability for us to really understand the current context of water in that local area. So it's about, and we often talk about this in terms of four key areas. One is understanding how water is being accounted for and who is accountable for it, right, in terms of management of water. Two, it's the water management practices. Three, it's the right targets that are being set, not at the corporate level, like we talked about, but really about the shared water challenges that you're facing in that local watershed. And like you said, that involves collective action, right? Being able to engage with others. And so that's the fourth area, which is water stewardship. It's saying that, the work that you're doing within the fence line is great, but it can't be done in isolation, like you said. You've got to think about others outside the fence line because water is a shared resource. Now, a great example of that for us, we actually have, nearly 100 facilities globally that we actually, as Ecolab, in manufacturing our products and that we use with our customers. We have a facility in Louisiana, down in the Gulf region. And that Gulf region, the name of the facility is Garyville. It's one of our larger water use plants. Now, if you think of Louisiana, Uwe, you don't think of water stress, but it's actually highly water stressed. There are issues with, challenges related to wetlands degradation. There's floodwater storage issues and imbalances. There's water quality and nutrient load issues. So in many ways, it's the we call it the Amazon of the United States, right? It is really challenged with some of the same issues. So we have a facility there. It sources water from the Mississippi River. We extract that water, we clean it, to your point about water quality, we clean it, we put it to use in our plant, and then we discharge about 88% of it back. Now, that 88% is cleaner than when we pulled it from the river. And that 12% that is now consumptive use, we feel that we need, to really contribute from a water stewardship perspective to really a net positive water facility. We wanted to replenish that water. And so what we did is we developed a three-pronged strategy around adopting water stewardship principles through the Alliance of Water Stewardship, which looks at that inside and outside the fence line shared water challenges and building collective action. Two, we drove a reduction in demand to the tune of almost 60 million gallons of reduced demand from the Mississippi River. But three, we also upstream worked with the Nature Conservancy, a large environmental NGO that does work on the ground in restoring water basins, where we worked on a project called Loch Levin to essentially replenish over 100 million gallons equivalent to the consumptive use of that facility. Now, that is a net positive water story. And in order to do that, to your point about taking the corporate target and making it localized, you really have to get down to that local level to understand how you need to engage with the local teams and the local authorities and stakeholders to really drive that kind of action.
No, I get that. This it resonates also with my experience in the past. But at the end of the day, that's that's a pretty complicated thing to do. You know, the devil is in the detail, as they say. Um, so, are you optimistic about this?
I am very optimistic, and just if you look at, and we're on the front line, and we have a unique perspective of the way water and other natural resources are being managed today by the multiple customers that we serve every day. And we see things, and we see that there's in many ways an opportunity across these different industries. And by the way, by geography, if I look at a beverage plant in Sao Paulo and I compare that to a beverage plant in Mumbai, India, there's a wide range of water use efficiency opportunities to really improve. And I think there's opportunities for us to really take action to really drive more water conservation that also not only saves energy but also reduces their carbon emissions. Another reason for optimism is the is that the incentive structure is right. It's easy to make the business case for smart water management because it saves money, right? And we can make that case if once you make that connection to, the fact that you can save energy, and that
Hmm.
obviously saves money, but it makes you more resilient in a world of risk, right? When you look at risk and you look at finance and the CFO for an organization, they're all about finding ways to reduce disruption, uh, uh, to not have stranded assets. And so we need to make sure that this is really at the heart of how we look at things, so that we're proactive, not reactive, when it comes to the work that we do around water. It's also important to remember that no company or industry can do this alone. And you mentioned this in your story, that collaboration and collective action is going to be required to make that happen.
Is I saw that you guys have been instrumental in launching this Water Resilience Coalition. Is that the background why you're doing that?
It is, yes. The coalition was launched on World Water Day this year. A bit of a whisper because of it
Mhm.
was on March 22nd on World Water Day, and of course we were in the beginning of a pandemic. But we felt it was important though to launch this action coalition around this critical challenge that we're all facing. We launched it with 11 member companies: AB InBev, Diageo, Dow, Ecolab, Gap, Microsoft PVH Corp, Coca-Cola, Heineken, Levi Strauss, and Woolworths. The goal of the coalition is to bring scale to corporate action on water, to preserve the world's freshwater resources through, first, we've talked about this, collective action in water stress basins; two, ambitious quantified commitments. And so we're working toward a resilient world that can adapt, which is important, to the impacts of climate change with enough clean water for all. And so the companies have made a commitment to join and sign what we're referring to as the Water Resilience Pledge, which they are expected to first make investments in their own operations, similar to my story about Garyville.
Mhm.
Two, work toward accomplishing the pledge's three overarching 2050 goals: net positive water impact, which delivers measurable net positive impact in water stress basins, and that's demand and supply based. Two, water resilient value chain, because the proliferation of the suppliers in our value chains and our customers. So implement best in class water resilient practices across the value chain. Global leadership, so raising the ambition of water resilience through public and corporate outreach, and really inspiring and recruiting more companies to join this action coalition.
Thanks. That is encouraging. But we live in times where I have to ask the question now: what changes because of the pandemic? Will this still be relevant?
Well, I mean, the first order of business today is to stop the pandemic and get people healthy and make sure that people are healthy. Um, but this pandemic shows really a key point, which is how interconnected our world is, and globalized risks affect everyone. Water scarcity and climate change are among the global risks we face in the coming years, as you know, and as we talked about. The lesson from the pandemic is really that we must address these risks before they become global crisis. And so water scarcity is already a crisis in many parts of the world, and is obviously impacting the effects that it has on the pandemic, namely that hygiene. Very difficult to have good hygiene practices in emerging economies when you don't have access to water. That 850 million people, they don't have basic water access to wash their hands. So that tackling water scarcity can help us, okay, not only get people healthy, but also help us exit this economic downturn that we're seeing and get out of it faster. And so the transition to a sustainable, resilient economy will unlock the opportunities from a technology breakthrough perspective and spark new industries. We know this. Every time there's a crisis, we see this happening. It'll build the infrastructure that we need and the technology platform, which hundreds of millions of people, with new jobs to help us rebuild, our economy. The COVID crisis also highlights, again, the importance of water in hygiene and public health. And we've got to continue to focus on, what we call these WASH initiatives, water and sanitation and hygiene programs that have emerged from a number of different organizations. So for us, with our CEOs involved, and we're seeing more and more executives really understanding the risk factors, and along with the backing of the UN, organizations as part of the coalition, the Action Coalition, can help make sure that we don't lapse into inaction or inactivity following this pandemic. We're going to stay the course.
Thank you so much, Emilio. This is a really interesting outlook, and I must say that, a number of things that really resonate. Also, talking to others, the need to collaborate more across boundaries. The crisis highlighting issues which we knew about, but we are facing now, and they need to be addressed in a better way, and they actually offer business opportunity if you understand the risk involved and know how to mitigate it. And you've given us some really good guidance on that. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. We were a little bit down when we looked at all the risk problems, but I think you've given us now good perspectives for the future. And I learned the link between climate and water, and that is something that I will take with me in the future discussions. So thank you again. And would you like to give our audience maybe a couple of guiding principles to go about?
Well, I want to first of all thank you for giving us this opportunity, this platform to really share, how critical and valuable water is as a resource to not only to grow our businesses, but to have countries and communities thrive. And so I'll leave you with this. We're in the middle of a pandemic right now, as we just talked about, but this pandemic will end. And we have to really look ahead beyond the pandemic. By 2030, over the course of this next decade, there'll be 1 billion more people on this earth. It is essential to rethink water so we can sustain the growth we need to lift more people out of poverty and to ensure that their lifestyles are sustainable. Thank you, Uwe.
Thank you so much, Emilio, and thank you to our listeners. And if you have enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our podcast series or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our site at tcb.org/podcasts. And dear listeners, we really appreciate your feedback and suggestions for future subjects. You can reach us via email at sustainability@theconferenceboard.org. And for now, thank you and goodbye.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.